recently we have been discussing a particular subject, and I have been trying to discuss it in many different ways, from the most ordinary and practical application to a more profound view. The subject is very broad and has both the elements of practical application in a very simple way and also a very profound and deep way of understanding or perspective. The subject generally, the general title that I would give the subject is spiritual fidelity. There are probably as many angles on that subject as there are human beings in the world. Not only at this time, but at every time in the past and at every time that will ever occur in the future. Because human beings, and really it is only in the human realm that we can actually practice spiritual fidelity, and that's why this is such a precious human rebirth, are as varied as snowflakes. We are all different. We all have particular karmic patterns that go to make up our nature, or our apparent nature, that is to say. And while underneath and in truth and in essence, our intrinsic nature is that of the Buddha. Our nature is that of the primordial wisdom state. Still, our assumption of ego as being essentially true, and the different cause and effect relationships that we have incurred due to that assumption have developed in as many different ways as we can possibly conceive of. Not only is each sentient being different in the way that they have come together, but also each one of us has an infinity of moods and changes that we go through on a regular basis. And so even while we are individual and different, we change continually. So spiritual fidelity can never be completely covered, can never be completely understood. Still, there are some general rules, some general techniques, some general understandings that I think can be helpful. For any of you that have come here for the first time and are interested in the subject, we have tapes that you can get of workshops and other teachings that can be had. But for today, I would like to move on with the subject and perhaps have a better understanding of where we're going with it. When it comes to spiritual fidelity, we have to think about what happens to us when we miss the mark and how to repair that. The reconstruction of our original pure spiritual impulse, that impulse that causes us to begin with faith on the path, is a skill, actually, that has to be accomplished and should never be forgotten, because it is a skill that we should use, that you will use again and again and again. There is no one here that can say that they have never had to use that skill. There is no one here that can say that they have never lost an awareness of spiritual fidelity. No one can say that. And I say that with confidence. The reason why I can say that with confidence is that we are all sentient beings. And that causes us to act in predictable ways. It causes us to do certain things that we do repeatedly. The original impulse that we feel when we begin to practice a path is what it is. We start where we start, according to our karma, according to our psychological makeup, according to all the cause and effect relationships that have occurred since our first assumption of self-nature as being inherently real, will cause us at a certain time to reach a point. And at that point, due to the ripening of our karma and due to the blessing of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who have come to the world to teach the method by which one can achieve realization, due to these causes coming together in a time and space grid, there will be a moment where we enter into the path. That moment is certainly a moment at which we are particularly blessed. It is a very precious moment. Of all the moments that we will ever experience in our lives, all of our multiple lives, since time out of mind and in the time to come, that will be one of the most precious. Hopefully that original intention to practice the spiritual path is a pure one, in that if we have been properly educated, while we may have been moving toward the practice of a spiritual path, the moment where we actually consider that path to be the most precious thing, and the moment at which we actually dedicate our lives to being a vehicle for achieving realization, with proper education, that moment should be considered very carefully. It should be free of ordinary considerations. For instance, we might think, if we were uneducated and thoughtless, we might think about the path in the same way that we think about buying some new clothing. We might think about buying new clothing, we might think, well, I'd look awfully good in this. And then about taking on the path, we'd think, well, I'd look awfully good doing this path. And so it should be free of that. It should be free of such ordinary considerations. And such ordinary considerations as the idea that we have that we should be good, or we should be worthwhile, or we should get the approval of others. It should be free of thoughts like that. We can think that if we get up and play our guitar and sing a song, that we will get the approval of others and everyone will like us. Well, we should not consider practicing spirituality or moving onto the path in the same regard. We should not think that if we stand up and become counted in a spiritual way, or if we stand up and declare that our lives are spiritual and that we are pure and keep our eyes ever skyward, that we will get the approval of others. If we consider the path in that way, then that is pretty much useless. There are certain ways that one should consider the path. In order to intelligently consider the path, as I have taught in the past few weeks, one should view for oneself the qualities of cyclic existence. One should note that life begins and life ends. Therefore, while beings are born, they also die. One should notice that things are impermanent, both bad things and good things, fun things and not so fun things. And so there is constantly change and constantly impermanence. And those things that we cling to, as well as those things that we suffer from, end. We should think that all sentient beings are revolving in cyclic existence, and almost all of them are revolving in such a way that they do not know how to practice a path. They do not know how to achieve enlightenment. And so they wander aimlessly. That's the expression that we have from the Buddhist teaching. They wander aimlessly. And so cyclic existence in that regard is faulted. And having looked around at all of that, we should see for ourselves that cyclic existence is not the ultimate experience. Then we must determine for ourselves what the ultimate experience is. And of course, we cannot directly determine that ultimate experience because we ourselves have not had it. We are not yet supremely realized Buddhas. And not being supremely realized Buddhas, we do not know enlightenment. Therefore, we have to turn to the advice and teaching of those who have achieved that state, and hear that they describe that state as the state beyond sorrow. the state that is free of desire, the state that is free of suffering, the state that has annihilated and pacified all of the cause and effect relationships that go to make up suffering, therefore is free, naturally free of all the causes of suffering. That in this state one is fully awakened and cognizant of the primordial wisdom nature, not specifically aware of this thing or that thing. That's more the relative point of view, the point of view that we ourselves experience. But a kind of cognition that is spacious and luminous and free of any limitation or contrivance. That spaciousness, that primordial wisdom nature, free of any kind of limitation, to be awakened to that, that is the experience of enlightenment. Accordingly, in that state, all cause and effect relationships are completely pacified. They are spontaneously liberated. In that when one perceives the primordial wisdom nature in that spacious way, free of any limitation and contrivance, and free of specific cognition, one also is aware in such a way as to be purely awake. That's different from being specifically aware of this and that. To abide spontaneously in a state of pure luminosity, to remain stable in that pure cognition. In that state, cause and effect are seen as indistinguishable from one another. In that state, subject and object are seen as indistinguishable from one another. There is no distinction of that kind. That kind of distinction is based on the belief in self-nature as being inherently real and the necessity to define self-nature by constantly defining subject and object. So the state that I am describing of pure awakening is free of that limitation. To abide spontaneously in that natural state, in that nature that is our nature, is to be awake as the Buddha is awake. Well, I've just given you this flowery explanation. What do you get from that? Well, if any of us have any sense at all, what we'll get from that is that that is the place to be. That is the state that one would wish to attain in order to be free of suffering. In fact, the Buddha describes that there is a state beyond suffering, that is the state called enlightenment. So when one takes upon oneself the experience of practice and the path, and one really dedicates one's life as a vehicle for supreme enlightenment, and really looks at one's life as being totally that, one is engaging actually in a very profound kind of renunciation. And one has to do that in a very pure way, through that kind of understanding. So that should be the initial experience. It should be pure in that regard. One should also look around at other sentient beings, not only oneself. Look around at other sentient beings and see that all sentient beings are experiencing suffering. That they all experience impermanence. That they all would be benefited by achieving enlightenment. That all sentient beings are revolving and wandering in cyclic existence. And looking around at the world, all you have to do is read the paper. You don't have to be omniscient. Looking around at the world, one can see that there is enormous suffering. You can't deny that that's true. You can see it yourself. And looking around at the world, one should have another pure thought when one begins the path, and that is, there is enough suffering. I have seen enough suffering. enough hunger, enough old age, enough sickness, enough death, enough war, enough catastrophe, enough loneliness. There is enough. And wishing to do something about that, wishing to engage in a life that essentially transforms that suffering by eliminating the causes, at first within one's own mind stream, and then ultimately to the degree that one can be of benefit to others. This then becomes the goal. So that's all very pure and all very wonderful. Well, how does one remain true to that? Because we won't, you know. Do you know what we'll do 10 minutes after we make this wonderful, pure discovery? We'll build ourselves a religion. We'll build ourselves a structure. And how will we do that? First, we should ask, why will we do that? We'll do that because we are egos, because we think of ourselves as egos. We believe in the solidity of self-nature. If it were not so, we would not distinguish a difference between subject and object. But we do, and therefore we do believe in the solidity of self-nature. And so believing in that, having made this wonderful decision with this enormous blessing being channeled and funneled into our lives, and even with the enormous purification that occurs within our mind streams when we do make this decision, the moment after we make that decision, we will begin to define ourselves accordingly. And that's where we begin to go downhill. Think about it. It happened to you. It happens to us every day. The moment we make that decision, we become a something. We become a spiritual practitioner. We become a person who's thinking about this. We become a person who has made a decision. And then our next decision is not based on that pure perception, that moment of pure perception. But our next decision is based on the fact that we are a spiritual person. And then we start moving further and further away from that spiritual fidelity. You who have taken robes, who are true renunciates, in some ways you are the most blessed. There is no doubt that there is a great bliss in achieving the opportunity and the practice of wearing the robes of the Buddha. There is no doubt that there is a great blessing in renouncing the things that caught you up before. But perhaps you may recognize that you are in more danger than anyone. Because the moment you put on the robes, you identify yourself as a monk or a nun. And you base your decision on the fact that you are a monk or a nun, not on the original idea, not on the original pure turning of the mind. It's not only them, all of us that practice, all of us that dance the dance and walk the walk and have the look, all of us that learn the vocabulary and sound like we're real good at this, all of us that have done this for longer than a week or 10 minutes, have built a continual structure based on ego. And that continual structure based on ego is supposed to be our spiritual life. Now, these are some harsh thoughts to think about ourselves and some hard words to hear, but they are, every one of them, true. We can't help but have a compulsive knee-jerk tendency to begin to build artificial structures. That is the nature of ego. Ego does that. The moment the idea of ego is assumed, the moment one assumes the reality of self-nature, one must immediately define it. Has to be. Otherwise, there is no ego. Without definition, it falls apart. And since you're still here, and you still exist, you're still doing it. So this must be true. Well, where does that leave us? Does that leave us in a hopeless place? How do we become pure spiritual practitioners? How do we keep our hearts open? His Holiness Dudjom Rinpoche, in one of his last written prayers before he made his transition, as they say, and left the world, and I would say before he attained his parinirvana. He wrote a confessional prayer, as some of you know, that touches the heart and cuts right to the bone. And in that prayer, he has us confess that our minds are as hard as horn. Because we are constantly building up these religions, these structures. I'm not talking about the world's great religions. None of us has built that. Fortunately, this structure, the world's great religions, generally came from those who had some spiritual experience that was powerful and valid. I know the Buddha gave his teaching directly from the mind of enlightenment. So I'm not even counting that. When I talk about making religions, I talk about us. Did we begin to formulate this idea of ourselves having taken a path and having had a spiritual idea? From that, we begin to assume something about ourselves, and we begin to define ourselves, and we begin to act like it, and we begin to adapt ourselves. And we build, and we build, and we build, and we build. And it's a structure, a psychological structure, that is very much like a religion in that it has its own doctrine. It has its own set of ideas. For some of us, it's very, very ornate. For some of us, it's very simple and very invisible. And perhaps that's the most dangerous. What do we do then? How do we overcome this? The first thing to do is to be aware of it. To have the courage to face oneself right square dead in the eye and see that this happens. And to not be shocked or surprised. Why should we be shocked or surprised when sentient beings act like sentient beings? Why should that surprise us? It's okay. You start where you start. And then knowing that this is the tendency, we must apply the antidote. The Buddhist philosophy is all about understanding what the tendencies of sentient beings are and applying the antidotes, so that one will antidote sufficiently to be able to view in a natural way, in a pure way, one's own true nature. So we should think to apply the antidote. Now, to apply the antidote, one should find a way to cut through that kind of spiritual structure. How does one cut through that kind of spiritual structure? Well, let's think of some ways that we can do that. Some of the tried and true methods that have been used by the great lamas and practitioners that have attained realization is simple retreat, during which one examines one's mind, watches one's mind, and applies the antidote to whatever one sees particularly arising within one's mind. If one sees, for instance, excessive desire arising within the mind, one would apply then the antidote to desire, which is a kind of renunciation, some kind of renunciation. Or one would examine desire and see the cause and effect relationships that are brought about through desire. Some other tried and true methods are confession. Now, we don't like confession because confession is what that other religion did. And that's kind of old age, so we don't like that very much. Well, I think that the best kind of spiritual intelligence is the kind that gleans what is to be gleaned from the sources that are valid. And the Buddha teaches us that confessional prayer is valid in that one cuts to the bone. One breaks down the structure that one spends a lot of time building up. One actually builds up a lot of structure surrounding the idea of self-nature as being inherently real and the definition of self-nature, if one actually begins to build up a lot of cause and effect relationships due to one's tendency to act in a certain way, and does that unconsciously, and that way is not productive, then one can examine what one has done, one can examine one's motivation, and one can openly discuss it or confess it or bring it out, sort of take it out of the closet. A good example of that would be that if one knows that generosity, for instance, produces good result and moves one closer to realization in that it antidotes desire, but one also knows that one has not been generous. Perhaps one has been generous with money but not with time, or perhaps generous with time but not with money, or one has been just not generous within one's own nature. Then one might openly confess that and admit that, and having admitted that, can apply the antidote by practicing generosity more effectively. So that's the kind of teaching that is given on that it's effective in that once it's out of the closet, one can view it, size it up, and apply the antidote. Some other ideas that one might have is that it is actually effective to reconstruct the innocence of one's first decision to enter onto the path. The innocence of that moment is tremendous, is mind-boggling. When one has actually looked at the world and seen that there is suffering and decided that one wishes to do something about it, when one has actually examined the content of cyclic existence and seen the difficulties due to that, when one has actually examined the enormous implication of a state beyond sorrow, the enormous idea of awakening to the primordial wisdom nature that is free, naturally free, and that is our nature, naturally free of any of the cause and effect relationships that make suffering. And from that, with one's whole heart, one takes the path, one takes the method to the heart. One can reconstruct that moment, and one should reconstruct that moment again and again and again. One should not be afraid of reconstructing that moment with such power and devotion and tenderness that tears well up in the eyes. One should not be afraid to reconstruct that moment every morning upon the arising of the sun, or every evening upon retiring. One should think that that moment is perhaps the only truly worthy moment that one has ever experienced. But in order to do that, one has to let go of the more materialistic idea that once one has adopted a path or has taken on a certain idea or spiritual philosophy, then one has become something. That isn't important. That's like putting on your daddy's clothes or your mommy's clothes. That means nothing. And so, one should truly understand that one has to cut to the bone. One has to cut to the quick. One has to distill the meaning of entering onto the spiritual path to the degree that one can hold it like a precious jewel in the essence, and hold it in one's heart. to do that, one has to have courage. It's a very courageous act to require of oneself that one should break down the games that one is constantly playing. That one should square off and face oneself dead in the eye. And trash, literally trash, anything that you have created as a superstructure on top of your original idea, including the idea of yourself as a spiritual person. To trash that, to annihilate it, is difficult. Because that's our true religion, you know, unfortunately. Until we get the big picture. Our true religion is self. And that's unfortunate, because self-nature is the opposite of the pure awakened state that is our true nature. The natural, uncontrived, primordial wisdom state, that pure view that is the Buddha's nature, that is your nature, in seed form. That should be your supreme object of refuge. That should be the ultimate goal. That should be the destiny toward which you yearn with all your heart. And in that regard is the thing that one focuses on with such power and such reverence that one kind of goes through one's life slashing and kicking at any structure or contrivance that keeps one from it. Here in this temple, yes, we're Buddhists, and you see us prostrating to statues of the Buddha. Well, what that means to us is that not that we accept a statue as our supreme object of refuge. We're not idol worshippers, or that we even, and sometimes we do prostrations to our teachers, and it doesn't mean that we have personality cults going. What we are doing when we do that is that we see as our ultimate object of refuge supreme enlightenment. If the teacher can do something to bring us supreme enlightenment, then they are an object of refuge. If the statue represents, as this statue of Guru Rinpoche does, supreme awakening, then that is to us a reminder that our supreme object of refuge is the Buddha nature. That's the point. That's what we're doing here. That's the name of the game here. And it has to be held so dearly, so fervently, so much more than anything else. And in order to do that, we have to overcome and break down what we do compulsively. And what we do compulsively is to move away from spiritual fidelity of that kind by creating ego structures and superstructures and religious structures constantly. And the dogma and the pain that go with them. I feel like to live that kind of spiritual life is not something for weenies. It's tough. You have to have courage. You have to be willing to break through your game constantly. And that's harder to do as you get older and older. Have you noticed that? The older you get, the more set you get in your little game. I'm comfortable now. So you get comfortable. Well, that's what I'm talking about. You also get drier and stiffer and older in your heart. Hold to that spiritual fidelity. It is the most precious tool that you have. Hold on to it for dear life. In doing that, you accept no substitute. You understand that your supreme object of refuge is the nature of your own mind, is the primordial wisdom state itself. You might consider that in order to do this, one has to live a life of a spiritual warrior, a powerful and courageous and energetic life, not to be taken lightly, but to be taken deeply. Nanda.